How more than 8,000 acres began to change hands. The story does not begin with a rezoning hearing. It begins with a purchase. Florida Power and Light acquired a large agricultural position in the Indiantown area for approximately $93 million. The total land under FPL control eventually exceeded 8,000 acres. That acquisition created the physical foundation for everything that followed. Ownership alone, however, did not change the legal character of the land. Turning agricultural acreage into an industrial entitlement required a sequence of institutional steps, each one removing a constraint that the previous step had exposed. Florida annexation law prohibits the creation of enclaves. Because of that restriction, FPL and the village could not bring the entire holding inside the municipal boundary in a single action. Only a core of roughly 5,722 acres could be annexed without fully enclosing unincorporated land. On February 12, 2026, the village adopted the final ordinance that accomplished that annexation. Even that carefully drawn boundary still produced a keyhole enclave, an irregular configuration that left remaining Martin County landowners in a constrained and partially surrounded position. The company had taken the statute as far as it would go in one move. Once the 5,722 acres sat inside the village, the old Martin County agricultural zoning became temporary. State law required the village to assign its own future land use designation. That requirement opened the next door. The village advanced a large-scale comprehensive plan amendment redesignating the property for light industrial use. State agencies reviewed the amendment and raised no fatal objections. With the policy foundation in place, a more detailed entitlement vehicle could follow. That vehicle was a planned unit development. On April 16, the Planning, Zoning and Appeals Board recommended approval of a PUD zoning agreement and master site plan. 1 week later, the Village Council held its first reading in a packed chamber. Residents warned about data centers, water demand, noise, heat, and the permanent loss of rural character. The opposition was sustained. It did not slow the calendar. On April 30th, the Council voted unanimously to approve the PUD. In approximately 11 weeks from final annexation, agricultural land had been converted into an industrial framework that explicitly contemplates data centers among other intensive uses. The timing of related events sharpened the picture. The day before the final PUD vote, a separate data center proposal, Silver Fox 606, was withdrawn without public explanation. Whether the two tracks were coordinated or merely coincident, the practical effect was the same. One high-profile data center application disappeared while a much larger industrial entitlement framework advanced. A legal challenge followed. On May 25, the Greater Indiantown Community Alliance and nearby property owners filed injunction, alleging among other things that the annexation created an illegal enclave and that the approval conflicted with the village's comprehensive plan and rural character. On July 2, the injunction was voluntarily dismissed with prejudice, due to poor statutory financial obligations to defend. The principal legal avenue that had been opened was closed. Throughout this period, a parallel track was supplying the physical capacity that intensive industrial development would require. Over successive state budget cycles, the village of Indiantown secured unusually large appropriations for water infrastructure, most notably successive reverse osmosis and transmission projects that culminated in a $46 million RO plant appropriation that survived the governor's 2026 vetoes. These were capacity expansions, not mere repairs. In a village of roughly 7,000 people, the scale stood out. New water production capacity reduced one of the hardest practical constraints on large industrial loads. The industrial land use framework, once approved, created demand that could justify the scale of the water investments. Each success made the next step easier to defend. None of this occurred in an institutional vacuum. FPL and its parent, NextEra Energy, maintain one of the most extensive political influence operations in Florida, with more than $33 million in state-level contributions since roughly 2017 and a large lobbyist presence in Tallahassee. Locally, FPL participates in the Economic Council of Indiantown, a body whose membership overlaps with village leadership and development-oriented interests. Those overlapping roles create informal channels that can smooth the path for priorities shared by major property owners and local decision-makers. Formal process still matters. Informal alignment often determines how quickly formal process moves. By mid-July 2026, the principal barriers had been cleared. More than 8,000 acres sat under FPL ownership. The annexable core had been brought inside the village, even if the resulting boundary produced a keyhole enclave. The land had been redesignated for light industrial use and entitled through a PUD on an accelerated timeline. Major new water capacity had been funded. A legal challenge had been extinguished. What remained was a landscape that only months earlier had appeared as agricultural land on the edge of a small rural village, and that now sat inside an industrial framework backed by state-supported infrastructure, with additional company-owned acreage waiting just outside the new line. The sequence was not driven by a groundswell of local residential or commercial demand. It was driven by the alignment of a major land purchase, municipal annexation authority, comprehensive plan policy, compressed entitlement procedures, legislative appropriations, and institutional capacity, each step enabling the next, until the path for intensive industrial use had been opened. Looking forward, the election as the next constraint. As of mid-July 2026, Village Manager Taryn Krisda has stated publicly that there are no open data center applications currently pending in the village of Indiantown. That statement is accurate on its face. It is also incomplete as a picture of what comes next. The industrial framework is already in place. The 5,722-acre core has been annexed, redesignated, and entitled through a planned unit development that expressly contemplates data centers and other intensive light industrial uses. Major new water production capacity has been funded. Additional FPL-owned acreage remains outside the boundary in a keyhole configuration. The legal challenge that sought to unwind the entitlement has been dismissed with prejudice. The absence of an active application today does not restore the agricultural character of the land or remove the entitlements that now attach to it. It simply means the next formal move has not yet been filed. 3 village council seats are up for election. All 3 incumbents have supported the path that produced the current framework. The opposition candidates have stated they do not want data centers and intend to pursue a moratorium. That divergence makes the coming election the single most important remaining check on the trajectory that has already been set. Why the election matters more than any single application. A moratorium is not a simple policy preference. Once a local government has granted a PUD and master site plan that contemplates certain uses, a subsequent attempt to freeze those uses can trigger legal exposure. Bert Harris claims, vested rights arguments, and related challenges. Village attorneys have already signaled caution on that point. An opposition majority would still face real legal headwinds if it moved immediately for a hard stop. What it would gain, however, is control of the Council's agenda, the willingness to impose stricter conditions on any future site plan applications, the ability to slow walk or scrutinize infrastructure commitments, and the political mandate to resist further expansion of the industrial footprint. In short, an opposition majority could raise the cost and friction of any future intensive proposal. An incumbent majority is far less likely to do so. The practical difference is decisive. The current framework does not require a new comprehensive plan amendment or a new annexation for a data center or similar project to move forward on the entitled land. It requires site plan approval and related development orders, decisions that sit with the council and staff that the voters are about to choose. There are two clear branches. If voters turn out and remove the incumbents, an opposition-controlled council could immediately signal that intensive data center development is not welcome. Even if a formal moratorium faces legal obstacles, the new majority could demand cumulative impact studies that were never completed, impose stringent noise, water, and heat mitigation conditions, require independent review of power and water demands, and refuse to fast-track any application. The existing PUD would remain on the books, but the political and procedural environment around it would harden. Further expansion onto the remaining FPL acreage outside the keyhole would become more difficult. The water capacity investments would still exist, but their justification as industrial-ready infrastructure would face political pushback. In this branch, the window for irreversible intensive development narrows. If the incumbents hold the seats, the framework already constructed continues without meaningful political resistance. No active application exists today, but the land is entitled, the water capacity is funded or under construction, and the council majority remains aligned with the industrial path. Under those conditions, the next logical steps are straightforward. One or more large load users, data centers or comparable facilities, can enter negotiations, file site plan applications under the existing PUD, and move through a process that the current leadership has already shown it is prepared to support. Additional boundary adjustments or infrastructure agreements involving the remaining FPL acreage become easier to contemplate. The economic council networks and overlapping local relationships that have helped smooth earlier steps remain intact. In this branch, the absence of an application today is temporary. The horizon is not if intensive development arrives, but when and at what scale. The longer horizon if the current trajectory holds. Looking further out, an unreformed council majority operating inside the existing entitlement and capacity framework points toward a transformed western edge of Indian Town. The agricultural and rural character that still defines much of the surrounding landscape would give way, parcel by parcel or phase by phase, to industrial and large load uses. Noise, light, heat island, and water resource impacts that residents have already flagged would become permanent features rather than hypothetical risks. Once major capital is sunk into buildings and infrastructure under the current PUD, the political and legal difficulty of reversing course rises sharply. The Keyhole enclave and the remaining FPL acreage create a natural pathway for further expansion. What began as a $93 million land purchase and an accelerated 11-week entitlement process would, in this scenario, mature into a lasting industrial district on the edge of a small rural village that never voted for that future in a clear, standalone referendum. The stakes in plain terms. There is no active data center application on the counter today. That fact should not be mistaken for safety. The applications will come when the political and procedural environment is judged favorable. The 3 seats on the ballot will determine whether that environment remains favorable or becomes contested. Voters who want to preserve the possibility of a different outcome have a narrow window. If the incumbents are returned, the institutional pieces already assembled, the PUD, the water capacity, the ownership position, the dismissed legal challenge, and the aligned local leadership, point toward continued movement along the industrial path. If enough voters decide that path is not the one they want, the election is the last readily available mechanism to change the composition of the body that will decide the next applications. The record up to now shows how quickly barriers can fall when ownership, municipal authority, legislative funding, and political alignment move in the same direction. The election will decide whether that alignment continues or is interrupted.